Hello, welcome to a revision video on the multiplier effect. This is a key concept in Year 1 macroeconomics. So what is the multiplier effect? What is the multiplier process? It's essentially the idea that a change in one or more of the components of aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, can actually lead to a multiplied final change in the equilibrium level of GDP. In other words, an initial stimulus to demand can have a greater final impact on the level of national output. And that's essentially what's meant by the multiplier effect. Multiplier effect is a process that comes about because injections of fresh demand for goods and services into our circular flow model, they then stimulate further second and third rounds of spending. The phrase one person's spending is another person's income is highly pertinent to understanding the multiplier. So if the multiplier effect is quite strong, an initial change in demand can actually have a marked significant effect on the final level of output and also jobs in the labour market. Now technically you need to know the formula for calculating the multiplier. It does depend on how many leakages you consider, and we'll work through a couple of examples in this session. But the formal calculation for the full multiplier is that the multiplier, it's just a number by the way, it's just a simple number, is 1 divided by the sum of the propensity to save, to tax and to import. Now that word propensity means if I give you another £100 of income, what is your propensity to spend? Well, let's say you spend £80 of it. That means your propensity to save at the margin is 20% or 0.2. So if we're giving people extra incomes, the key to understanding the multiplier is how much of that extra income they choose to spend rather than the money leaving the circular flow in savings, in tax to the government, or in money leaving the economy in the form of imported goods and services. But don't worry, we'll come back to the calculation of the multiplier in just a second or two. I think it's important initially to think about the multiplier process as an idea. So we make a distinction between the positive multiplier effect, and this is when an initial increase in one or more injections of demand leads to a greater final increase in real national output. It could also be actually a fall in a leakage, but normally it's an increase in an injection. For example, an increase in investment spending or a rise in export sales from overseas. A negative multiplier is the reverse. It's when an initial decrease in, for example, investment or perhaps government spending leads to a final decrease in GDP, which is greater than the initial proximate cause. Now the process itself, if you get a chance, explain the likely process of the multiplier. And the key to this is to understand the circular flow of income and the interrelationships between different parts of the economy. Take, for example, the government announcing a significant £200 million project to build lots of new affordable homes in different parts of the country. So that's an initial injection of demand. The project itself is eventually, if the project runs to budget, it's going to be worth £200 million of extra output for the construction sector. It's going to generate some extra demand and GDP. But then we start to think about the likely multiplier effects. And there are many, many businesses who, in theory, stand to benefit directly from this investment project in new housing. Architects, engineers, consultants, the suppliers of cement and bricks, all kinds of supply chain industries potentially will see the financial benefits from this investment in affordable homes. And building thousands of homes is going to generate a new flow of factor incomes. That's an important idea. Factor incomes are a flow. So the wages of people working in construction, the profits of the building industries, there'll be some new factor incomes generated. Now, the project is creating some new demand. It's establishing and generating some new output. The key to the multiplier, everybody, is whether the extra incomes then stay within or inside the circular flow of income and spending. For that, you have to think about your circular flow model. If they do stay inside, the multiplier effect could be quite strong, and therefore the £200 million housing project could end up having a much bigger effect on final GDP. Over time, this process won't happen straight away. We're probably talking a multiplier effect lasting at least several months, perhaps a few years. So just in terms of some simple numbers, everybody, if, for example, there's a £200 million housing investment project, if the final increase in measured GDP is, let's say, 300, then the multiplier is the change in GDP, 300, divided by the initial injection, 200, and that gives a multiplier coefficient of 1.5. However, if the final increase in GDP is a little smaller than that, let's say 250 million, then we get a smaller multiplier. 250 divided by 200 is 1.25. Now this slide is important. The coefficient of the multiplier is essentially what we're looking at here. Now the value of the coefficient depends crucially on the three leakages and the rate at which money leaves the circular flow as extra income is generated. In our simple example here, we're going to assume that for every £100 of extra income, that could be the wages, the extra £100 of wages of people working in the building sector, or it could be £100 of dividend income to a shareholder of a company. For every £100, we're going to assume that 10% is saved. That's the marginal propensity to save. We're going to assume that 20% goes to the government in a form of tax, income tax for example, and we'll also assume that 20% of any extra income is leaking from the economy because people are buying imported goods and services. So we have three leakages, and if you add them together, and I've done the maths, believe me, this is true, if you add them together, for every extra £100 of income, 50% will leave the circular flow every time the money goes around the system. And of course, at each extra stage, the extra money flowing around the circular flow from the initial injection will get smaller and smaller. So if you look at the bottom of this slide, everybody, our £200 million injection adds to GDP. We know that 100 million of that will leak from the circular flow in savings and tax and imports. So that should feed through to an extra £100 million of extra GDP in the second round, if you like. And assuming the same propensities to save and tax and import as we had before, another 50 will then leak out of the economy. That's going to inject what's left, £50 million of extra GDP, and so on and so forth. Now, I hope you're with me on the maths here, but we started off with a £200 million injection. We've gone up to 300 million by adding extra 100 million. We're up to 350 by adding an extra 50. Then we'll add 25, then we'll add 12, and what have you. It's obviously it's halving every time. If you add together the final increase in GDP, it's going to come to 400 million. Can you see that? And the reason is because the multiplier is 2. Why is the multiplier 2? Because the multiplier is 1 divided by the sum of the leakages. And our leakages sum to 0.5. See the top corner of the slide here? So 1 divided by 0.5 gives a coefficient of 2. Now, there are two types of calculation for the multiplier. One is what's called the simple multiplier. It's the one I like most because it's just the simplest. We just assume there's only one leakage, saving. So we ignore tax, we ignore imports. So the multiplier then is 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. In other words, 1 divided by 1 minus the rate at which people spend their extra income. So in this example on the slide here, people are spending 80% of any extra income and they're saving 20%. Can you see that? So the multiplier is 1 divided by 0.2, which gives quite a high value of 5, because we've only got one leakage, so money will go round and round time over. In the second, more complex formula, we add in the two other leakages, we add in imports and taxation. So now we've got 1 divided by 3 leakages, savings, tax and imports. For the sake of argument, I've assumed they sum to 0.7. Okay, a bit higher than we had on the previous slide. So 1 divided by 0.7 gives 1.43. Can you see that the higher the rate of the leakage from the circular flow, the lower is the coefficient of the multiplier? If you can see that, then take a bow, because you're pretty close to nailing the multiplier. I can hear what people are saying. They're saying, well, what about elasticity of supply? Why does that affect the multiplier? Well, funnily enough, it does actually. Here, in our example on the left-hand side here, aggregate demand has shifted out to the right. 81 has shifted out to 82. Maybe that was caused, for example, by an increase in exports. Or it could have been the government housing programme that we talked about before. Now, the aggregate supply curve I've drawn here is perfectly elastic, and therefore it's pretty easy for the economy to ramp up or increase their production from Y1 to Y2 without any increase in inflation. So when the supply side of the economy has plenty of spare capacity, the multiplier effect has actual room to happen, the scope for output to increase. Hopefully you can see that. However, the aggregate supply curve might be inelastic. And if we draw another outward shift of demand from 81 to 82, in this case we don't quite get the increase in output, it's only a marginal increase. By the way, that should say Y2 on the right hand side then. Instead, what we do is we get some inflationary pressure. So when aggregate supply is inelastic, it's much harder for the economy to produce the extra output which will generate the multiplier effect. Instead, we might just end up with inflation. What's the takeaway point from this slide? When aggregate supply is elastic, the multiplier effect will be bigger than when the economy is running up against supply constraints. So just to round off, the multiplier effect will tend to be high when an economy has plenty of spare capacity. We would call that a negative output gap. So there's lots of spare land and labour and capital available to meet the increased demand. Multiplier tends to be high when the propensities to import and tax are low. Those are two key leakages. And crucially, when people receive some extra income in their pay packet, they go out and spend it on domestically produced goods and services rather than save it. Multiplier effect will tend to be lower when an economy is coming up close to its capacity limits, during, for example, the tail end of an economic boom, when people's extra income leaks out of the system in the form of imported demand, or perhaps, for example, when an injection of demand actually triggers some inflation, which then causes perhaps the central bank to start increasing their interest rates, which would dampen and deflate other components of demand. One of the big topics just at the moment is the size of the fiscal multiplier. So government spending is a key part of aggregate demand. And if the government is spending more on new motorway infrastructure, or building some flood defence schemes, or just generally an increase in, for example, capital spending on schools and hospitals, economists are very interested in knowing the size of the multiplier, the fiscal multiplier. And the IMF have done some work on this, quite interesting results. They reckon that in the long run, the multiplier for these kind of big projects is more than 1. It's probably around 1.5 for developed countries, slightly higher possibly for developing countries. I'll leave you to think about the possible reasons why that might be the case. But folks, we're not talking about multipliers of 2 or 3 or 5 or 10. We're talking about possible multipliers of 1 point something. So the multiplier is a number, but it's not a huge number. Indeed, there's a controversy in economics about whether it's a positive number at all. Hey, that's for another time. So thanks for joining in on this one. We've covered the multiplier. Hopefully the last 15 minutes or so has been useful for you. It's an important macro topic, and we're covering lots more on our Tutor2You website and of course on the YouTube channel. Thanks for joining in, and see you again soon.